Okay, so we're into postmodernism. Before that, in terms of your midterms, um, hopefully you saw my message saying that the grade that you instantly get back is not your grade, right? That's just the multiple choice and true and false questions that are automatically graded. I will go through next week and get everything else graded, so your actual grades will be up next week. Someone brought to my attention that one of the true and false questions had like 6 options, and I don't know how that happened, but don't worry about that. I'll just give all of that to you as a freebie. But yeah, so moving into postmodernism, right? So post World War II, there are a lot of questions about what the purpose of art is. Um, why is it important post dropping of the atomic bombs and post the Holocaust, and what its purpose is? You know, a lot of writers questioned, the world was so horrific and we saw our true, not to use a supernatural term, but evils. Um, so where do we go from there, right? So postmodernism opens up even more ideas about digging into ourselves, really, right? You know, um, we've looked at American Romanticism and realism and naturalism, um, and modernism, and a handful of subcategories within there: the Harlan Renaissance, Imagism. Um, but now people are looking even more inward, right? Um, and a lot of scholars believe that that has to do with the atrocities of World War II, right? We're trying to look deeper into ourselves to see, how, if possible, we can heal ourselves, heal each other. Um, what's wrong with society, which is a lot of what How, that we're going to look at this week by Allen Ginsberg, is all about. Um, and our first subcategory of postmodernism that we'll talk about a little bit is the Beat Generation, right, which consists mainly of Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, Gregory Corso, Gary Snyder, to name a few. Um, Here's a picture of Ginsberg being himself. He always enjoyed playing the fool, right? He would go on live TV and just do Hare Krishnas, and people would be like, what's the point? Like, what is poet doing? Um, and a lot of his friends called him out for all of these kind of shenanigans, and his response was, "Well, I'm a poet, right? I'm the classical fool." Um, you know, and in classical theater and Shakespeare, the fool is meant to kind of be a foil that can get away with anything, right? The fool can mock a king and not get imprisoned or executed, right? The fool can point out all of the atrocities or issues with, other people, and then also culture at large, and really get away with it without any repercussions. And this is kind of what Ginsberg was always doing, even though, as we'll see, there obviously were repercussions because he got thrown into an asylum for a while. Um, but yeah, I think this picture sums up Ginsberg quite a bit. Covered in snow with a giant sign that says "pot is fun," right? So, um, I thought I wouldn't write a poem, but just write what I wanted to without fear. Let my imagination go, open secrecy, and scribble magic lines from my real mind. Sum up my life, something I wouldn't be able to show anybody. Write for my own soul's ear and a few other golden ears. This is a quote regarding how, and how personal some of it is. Um, But it also says a lot about how quite a few writers do feel about the act of writing, right? You should always be writing for yourself so that you're not self-conscious, really, of what others will think of you if you just consider the fact that it's only for you and maybe a few close friends, um, you know, so you can just be open, right? There's a lot of Ginsberg's beliefs. Um, The story of Ginsberg's early life is colorful and as interesting as his poetry. From his humble beginnings in the shadow of New York City and Newark, New Jersey, to his off and on education at Columbia, Ginsberg's journey as a social outsider was ultimately finds a place for himself in a quintessentially American story. Ginsberg read his poetry and held office hours in universities all over America, office hours and heavy quotes. Um, a presence at everything from Beans, an example here, which were mass outdoor festivals of chanting costumes and music in the 60s, to anti war, anti Vietnam protests. He was a gentle and persuasive presence at hearings for many kinds of reform, from revisions of severe drug laws and laws banning homosexuality. He also had a lot to do with the City Lights bookstore, which was started by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was another member of the Beat movement. He did a fair amount of his own writing, but mostly he was a publisher. Um, Ginsberg moved to San Francisco, proved to be a transformative experience in his personal and professional life. There, he met Peter Olzowski, his partner for over 40 years, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, right, whose City Lights bookshop became the publisher of Howl. The night Ginsberg read the new poem aloud at Sixth Gallery has been called the birth trauma of the Beat generation. So the Beat generation begins in the 40s and the 50s, right? So in the 40s and the 50s, a new generation of poets rebelled against the conventions of mainstream American life and writing. They became known as the Beat poets. So we have on the left Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road. Center, that is a younger Allen Ginsberg. And then to the right, we have William S. Burroughs. Um, the name, the Beats, right, is meant to evoke a weariness, a downtrodden, kind of down and outness. The beat under a piece of music, particularly jazz, and beatific spirituality. At first, they organized in New York City, LA, and San Francisco. By the 1950s, poets at the heart of the movement had settled in the Bay Area, especially in neighborhoods near Beat poet and publisher Lawrence Ferlinghetti, right, as we just talked about. Um, as a movement, the Beats sought to write an authentic, unfettered style. One time, Ginsberg said, "First thought, best thought," which arguably, a lot of poets after that took it as, you know, the first thing that you come up with is best and you don't have to edit it. And that's not at all what he meant, because he edited Hal for years. Um, and as you'll see, I have put a link to a YouTube video of Ginsberg reading Hal, I believe in 1959, and you should read along because it is subtly different, right? Because he was still editing it, but it is much better to hear it in his voice than mine. Um, but poetically experimental and politically dissident, the Beats expanded their consciousness through explorations of hallucinogenic drugs, sexual freedom, Eastern religions, and as Whitman and Dickinson, would hark back to with American Romanticism, um, reverence and a sublime spirituality gained from the natural world. They took inspiration from jazz musicians, surrealists, metaphysical poets, visionaries such as William Blake and haiku and Zen poetry, which also in some ways goes back to Imagism. And Ezra Pound. In his article, Driving the Beat Road, Jeff Wise explains more than a half century after their emergence, the Beats still offer up a wild style, a sense of freedom and wonder for the natural world almost unrivaled in post war literature. Beat poetry emerged from the disillusionment that followed World War II, a period of unimaginable atrocities, including the Holocaust and the use of nuclear weapons against Japan. Following the end of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union quickly entered a Cold War, a period of geopolitical hostility that created paranoia and cultural and political repression at home. By the mid 1950s, the Beats helped to spearhead a cultural vanguard reacting against institutionalized American values, materialism, and conformity. These are all themes that we will see in How, right? This How that Ginsberg is letting out, kind of rebelling against mainstream America. On October 7th, 1955, the Beats gave their first major public reading, a seminal event held at Six Gallery in San Francisco. Among the 5 poets to perform their work was Ginsberg, who first read How, a poem in the tradition of Walt Whitman that Ginsberg described as an emotional time bomb that would continue exploding, the military industrial nationalistic complex. So, very much so like Whitman, Ginsberg, over half a century later, is pointing out what he believes to be wrong with the United States, right? What needs to be fixed, what it truly means to be an American. Um, you know, from Whitman trying to reconcile the death of Lincoln and reconnect, um, the nation and when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, to his I Hear America Singing, right, where he's kind of praising this kind of hard work and love for your country and for individualism and oneself, to Langston Hughes, right, pointing out to Ginsberg that, oh, hey, you missed a massive part of the population by not mentioning a single black person. And I Hear America Singing. Um, Ginsberg follows in that tradition of pointing out this kind of counterculture of people, essentially, right? And pointing out what he believes to be wrong with America. So, how combined apocalyptic criticism of the dull, prosperous Eisenhower years of the United States with this exuberant celebration of an emerging counterculture, right? It was best known and most widely circulated book of poems in its time, and with its appearance, Ginsberg became, part of the history of publicity as well as the history of poetry. Hal and Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road were the pocket Bibles of generation whose name Kerouac had coined beat, with its punning overtones of beaten down and beatified, right? So it has a very kind of diametric meaning of being down and out, but also, kind of elevated and, almost at nirvana in one way or another. How is Ginsberg's most celebrated poem? It's a deft portrait of a generation that uses the long, sprawling, free verse lines innovated by Whitman to capture the chaos, diversity, and madness of the post war years. Ginsberg attempted, as did Whitman before him, to make his individual voice reflect the broad cultural milieu of the world in which he lived. If his work is to be read autobiographically, as it probably should be, an important moment to identify is when the speaking voice of the poem transitions from being that of an individual person and becomes a collective utterance of the best minds of my generation, which we will definitely dig into when we get there. A few things for you to consider, right? What is Ginsberg saying about the urban experience. And we have our list of major themes, right? We'll obviously get more into these when we look at the piece, but we have madness, rules and order, freedom and confinement, religions, visions of America, and celebrations of life. Um, Hal's, I believe, 8 pages. It's about as long as When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, but it's in 3 sections, and I will have a video up for each section.